Okay, so here we have the first example, and this example is more oriented to the positivism paradigm or positivism stance. So the research question in this example is, what is the best height for a table? Very simple question. Still, you can criticize this question. You can say like, put it into some context or what type of table, but let's keep it simple. What is the best height for a table? That is a very good question for a positivism stance, because you assume that the answer is there, right? Like there should be the ideal height for a table. This is something maybe that IKEA has wondered, right? Like what should be the best height? Like we know there's tall people, short people, but in average we should, or in average rate, which is the best height for a table. So the answer is there. We just need to know which is the best height. So the epistemological assumption is that knowledge is valid if there is data, enough data regarding the length, probably in centimeters, of a table that people buy in the market. So you need to base your knowledge, you need to base your research on data that is very objective and that is measured, right? Because the answer is there. You want to find, you want to discover it. And the methodological way to do it is to do an analysis of a data set of tables that are being sold, and then you do some analysis, statistics or something, and you find which is the best height for a table, right? So I think it's a very simple and interesting assumption, and it's fine if this is your research topic. Well, that's very simple, but if your research topic is kind of like this, what is the best, what is the ideal, what is, I don't know, something like that, then you have this path, right? Like you are following more or less this path in here. But kind of the same field, but a different question. If instead of what is the best height for a table, I am interested in understanding why do people sometimes use tables to sit? That's a kind of interesting question, right? Because this question even questions the assumption that a table is a table, right? Like here, somewhere in there, we assume that a table is a table. But here, we even question that assumption, like, is really a table, or why do some people use a table as a chair? So that is kind of a very question or research project related to an interpretivism stance. In terms of the ontological assumption, that's the thing. We don't assume that the table is a table. We assume that a table can be perceived or interpreted differently depending on how people interpret or assume what a table is, right? Like maybe at some point you see a table and you see it's a table, but I can sit, so you sit. So I want to understand why that happens. Then the epistemological assumption is that if I want to build valid knowledge to answer to this question, I need to understand what are the perceptions regarding the use of a table, right? So the focus is on understanding the perceptions. I want to build knowledge from the perceptions, not from data. I am not going to measure or something like that. That's not what I want to do. That was for the other one, but here is different. Maybe the height is related, but the number doesn't give you anything. You need to understand, right? Like maybe higher tables are more difficult to sit on. So maybe the height is important in the process, but you need to understand the process and not only saying height is important. No, that's not the answer to this question. And then later in the terms of the methodology, maybe it's kind of a weird or funny methodology, but you can do interviews with people who sit on table and people who don't sit on table, and then you ask them how do they, but what happens, why do they think that when they sit, or why, I don't think so. But it's an interview, is a conversation with these people who sit on a table, right? So as you can see, it's quite similar topic, but very different question and very different assumptions and very different methods depending on what's your path, right? And both are valid, right? Both are interesting. It just depends on how do you choose or what do you choose. Then business example. This can be actually something that you can use for your thesis. Students have used this in previous thesis. Like positivism, again, another example from the positivism stance. The research question is, what is the effect of multicultural boards in financial performance of non-public firms? So very positivism oriented. You assume that the answer to this question is there. The effect is there. I just need to discover the effect. So to create knowledge to answer to this question, I need to use data regarding multicultural boards and financial performance. So very measurable, very objective data. And the methodological assumption, how do you do this? It's probably a survey maybe, or you use data sets from companies that have a multicultural board, and then you check that with their financial reports, and then you find correlations with very objective things, right? So it makes sense, I think. Is it clear? I hope it is clear, this example. And then you have the similar example, but from a interpretivism-oriented or interpretivism stance. And again, this is also a research question that you can address in your thesis. It's hot topic, is relevant. There's research being published on this. It is, how do non-public firms implement a multicultural board? So here you are interested not on the effect, you are interested on the process, right? So you don't assume that the answer is there. The answer to your question needs to be understood, needs to be put into context, needs to be drawn from interpretations. The ontological assumption is that the benefits and challenges can be interpreted differently in every firm, and so then it doesn't make sense to do to have huge amounts of data, because you want to understand the process. The epistemological assumption in here is that knowledge is valid to answer to that question only if you can understand how the firms or people inside of the firm interpret the challenges and benefits from a multicultural board, right? So again, the focus is on interpretations and understanding. And finally, instead of collecting data or sending a huge survey like before, here the methodology will be more oriented to do like a case study to understand how a process happened in an organization, maybe a comparative case study, maybe to firms, and you identify differences. But again, the objective is to understand the process. So finally, I just want to, this is also something I think very important, because in the end, we tell you as teachers that this is the first thing, this is choose your paradigm. But I think it's a huge challenge to choose a paradigm if you don't really know what's in there. So my suggestion is that to choose a paradigm, you should ask these 4 questions. Like, first, what is the nature of your research objectives? Because this is ideal. This is what you will read in the book. In the book, it says like, define this question. If this is your question, then it is very clear what you will do. So this is the first step. Define your question. What is the nature of your research objective? What is your research question? What is your research objective? And that will give you almost the answer. But that's not true in real life. That's true in theory. But in real life, we have other 3 things that are very important. The first thing that's very important is what data do you have? Because if you ask this question, but you don't have access to one case study or this one, but you don't have the time to do a survey of 10,000 firms, then maybe you will say, I don't have the data. So maybe you will need, you change, right? Even if that question was interesting, you can still change, because you need to consider what data do you have or what data you can create. The next one is, what available resources do you have? So maybe you say, I really like this. It sounds really good. But maybe you are not the best in statistics, or maybe you don't have the software that you need to do your analysis, or maybe you don't have access to the data set. You don't have the resources. So maybe because of these limitations, you will change your research objective, right? And the final thing is, what is your personal stance? I know that I'm telling you, try to be as flexible as possible. I think that is the best for your peace of mind. And I mean, like in practice, we as researchers tend to feel more comfortable on one side of this philosophical stance. And then we became like very arrogant, like saying like my stance is better or anything like that. But in reality, none of them is the best or anything. And it's true, like you feel more comfortable on one of them. So that's the last thing that you should consider. Like, are you really feeling comfortable there? And then, because it's very important that you feel comfortable, like, again, try to be a neutral, try to narrow it down to your research. Like I assuming this for my research, and not like everything is this, it's just my research. But in the end, your personal stance is important. And not only your personal stance, also your group, if you are doing this in a group, or even your supervisor. So be careful on that. But in the end, this is a more important thing. What is the nature of your research objective? But then reflect on these three things, because maybe these three things will change the objective of your research. Well, that's the end of this video. In the next video, we're going to talk a little bit more about methodologies. And then later in the actual lecture, we're going to go into the